Welcome to MacroHive Conversations with Bilal Hafiz. MacroHive helps educate investors and provide investment insights for all markets from crypto to equities to bonds. For our latest views, visit macrohive.com. So welcome, Deb, and it's great to have you on the podcast show. I've recently come across your work, and I'm very happy to have you on the show.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Now, before we go into what I wanted to talk to you about, I do like to learn more about my guest. And so it would be great to hear something about your origin story. What did you study at university, your journey from that point onwards, and some of the key milestones along the way.
So I was an East Asian studies major in college. So I started studying Chinese language, history, etc. as an undergraduate. Went to China directly after undergraduate and taught English for a year.
What sparked that interest in China and East Asia? Because this was what decade was this?
This was the 80s. I mean,
yeah.
So I had always been interested in other countries. I took French and Spanish in high school because those were the only two languages offered. And at some point in high school, I read an article in the New York Times about how so few people in America studied Chinese. And I said, well, I'm going to do that when I go to college. And then my mom kept reminding me of that as I was applying to colleges. And I think the British system is different, but in the US, you always have to ask a question in these interviews. And so, do you have Chinese became my question because I needed something to say to these people. And so when I got to college, I decided to study Chinese. Found that really hard, but I really liked the history and everything else. So I sort of kept it up. And so after college, I went to China, taught English. That was one of the most important experiences for actually being able to work effectively in China, because I was working in a Chinese work unit, had a boss, started to understand sort of the social structure of daily life in a way that I think people who originally show up with either just as students and don't actually spend time as workers there or only work for foreign organizations never really get. And then I went back to the States. I had already taken the Foreign Service exam. I paralegaled for a law firm while waiting to figure out what was going on. If I hadn't gotten into the Foreign Service, I was going to go to law school, but Foreign Service saved me. And I went into the State Department, served 20 years in the State Department, in China, I guess 3 times, in India, Nepal, and New Zealand. I already spoke Chinese. They gave me more Chinese language training at one point. I also got Hindi language training in the State Department. Really loved, especially the fact that you got to study every so often when you were in the State Department. I studied languages, I studied economics, I got to go back to Princeton during my State Department tour and get a master's, and I chose to focus on science, technology, and environmental policy when I did that because I was going out to Beijing as the science counselor. And that was my last State Department job. That was 2003 to 2007. So it was science, technology, environment, and health. And
that was a big growth spurt for China in the 2000s. That period, the massive commodity boom induced by China's sort of rapid growth in that decade.
So it was a growth spurt economically, and it was also a period of really heightened U.S.-China cooperation in these fields. So after SARS, which was 2003, we really built up the U.S.-China health relationship, brought in a lot more people from CDC, brought in our first NIH person, brought in our first actual health attaché. We were also building up our science relationship. We brought in a National Science Foundation office at that point, building up our energy relationship, in part because of the importance of climate change. So we brought in an energy attaché as well. And my office was sort of responsible for negotiating all that, getting all those people in country and, really working on those issues. So it was a really interesting time to be working on the cooperative relationship. and an interesting time in terms of China and its transformation from focusing only on economic growth to focusing on some of these social issues. This is actually the period after SARS when the Chinese government becomes much more concerned about ensuring there's health care for people. And after a horrendous oil spill in 2005, in taking the environment much more seriously. So it was a very interesting era. I then left the State Department in 2007 and worked for 5 years at the World Resources Institute as a senior advisor on the China Energy and Climate Program. I was working out of the Beijing office, and that was really interesting. We did a whole bunch of cooperative programs with Chinese partners sort of on improving understanding of various aspects of climate policy. And then I decided that I wanted to transition into academia. So I came back to the US and got a PhD in political science at the University of California, San Diego. And that I wrote my dissertation on how corporate concentration, sort of whether there's monopoly or competition in an industry, affects environmental governance. And then I started working as an assistant professor at Villanova University, which is where you find me now.
And where's Villanova?
So Villanova is in the suburbs of Philadelphia. I live in downtown Philadelphia and do the reverse commute.
So back on the East Coast then.
Yeah.
Great. And, one of the reasons I wanted to speak to you was that you were in China for quite a long time towards the end of last year, I think it was, while China was still had its zero COVID policy, and you kind of saw the changes that were going on sort of back then. So maybe could you sort of tell us a bit, when did you, or why were you in China, and what kind of happened while you were there, and what was it like from the ground?
So I was there from October 16th last year to January 7th of this year. And I went to work on a project I have with some fellow academics looking at U.S.-China climate cooperation over the past 30 years with an eye to sort of how should it change over the next 10 years or so. This was inspired by the joint declaration at Glasgow in 2021. The two countries said they were going to resume cooperation. And so much has changed in both countries that it seemed like we should really think about what that cooperation has been, what worked, what didn't work, and what might work in the future. So that was the idea of the project. I got there mid-October. I knew I was going to have to do 10 days of mandatory quarantine before I got anywhere near the university I was at. I did my mandatory quarantine in Shanghai. I then took the train to Beijing, and they said, you were in Shanghai and there are now some cases, so you need to go into quarantine again for 7 days.
Going into quarantine means what? Is it like a special facility they put you in, a sort of designated hotel, or can you stay in your own residence?
So when you arrive in country, they're designated hotels that are only quarantine hotels, and that somebody I saw called that closed loop quarantine. So you're literally for those first 10 days, I'm in a room. I realized at the end of it that I had never been issued a key to the room, and the lyrics to Hotel California were running through my head. You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave. And literally somebody brings a tray of food to your door and sticks it outside the door and knocks on the door and runs away 3 times a day. And every day or other day, because it's sort of like 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 10, they come and they give you a COVID test. And that's literally the only person you encounter for those 10 days. Once I was in Beijing, it wasn't the same. I was in a hotel, a regular hotel, because I had just checked into the hotel that my co-authors had like booked for me. And when they were then told I had to be in quarantine, they had a floor of the hotel that was designated for all the people who were told they had to be in quarantine. So I was moved to a different floor, and it was not nearly as airtight. So I could so first of all, I could get food delivery, anything I want. So I spent those few days mastering the Chinese food ordering apps, which you really can't get anything you want. But also they didn't have testing on premises because they weren't a quarantine hotel. So every day and then every other day I had to go out to get tested. So I, got on the elevator, walked through the lobby, even though I was supposedly under quarantine, walked out on the street, and you didn't go to the regular testing booths, which were everywhere. You had to go meet on this specific street corner where all the people that had some issue that they had theoretically been in some area where they'd been exposed would line up, and a car would pull up, and you would check in with the guy sitting in the front passenger seat, and then you would go to the rear passenger seat behind him, open your mouth and bend over, and some guy on the other side of the window would come and stick a swab in your throat. So it was a little bizarre. And so
But from the hotel walking to that site, you could go to a shop, you could go anywhere. Or not,
so you couldn't really get into any shops without a green code on your phone. So yeah, I could have gone on a 2-hour walk, but I was worried if I did that, then they might throw me in a quarantine center when I got back, and I didn't want to lose my sort of relative comfort of the hotel, right? So I just thought complying was a good idea. I didn't walk particularly fast, but I just went to it and I came back. And most of the other people who were there were people who had contact with someone who had been exposed or something, but they themselves had never tested positive. So those people who had homes in Beijing were allowed to stay in their homes and just show up to get tested. If you tested positive prior to December 7th, you would be stuck in one of these quarantine facilities or fever hotels, which were essentially big warehouses. I mean, they were all different kind of things that were used, but they were extremely basic and have been widely described as extremely unpleasant. So by the time I got to Beijing, everybody was busy trying to figure out how to avoid getting exposed. The number of cases was clearly going up. There were a lot more at that point down south than there were in Beijing, but the rumors would be people kept saying to me once I finally got out of quarantine, don't go to Chaoyang district, which was another district over on the east side of town, because there are too many cases and you might you might be exposed, and that's a problem. So people were very much sort of avoiding going out too much. Most people were just going to work, just going home, trying not to do anything else, because people were very afraid of getting stuck in a fever hospital. And so, I mean, by the time I was there in November, there were no traffic jams in Beijing, and there are always traffic jams in Beijing. So people were already really modifying their behavior. What they weren't really modifying was mask use. Certainly by the time I got there, the mask use was entirely for show. People would put them on to walk through a gate with a guard and then take it off again. In my office at the lab I was at, people would wear it into the building and then take it off the minute they got into the office. And it was a group office. So the exposure risk was much higher in the office than at the doorway. So people were modifying some behaviors, but not others. And There
And
was
what was the
just
status of like shops, the trains, restaurants, kind of just
so
those sorts of things?
so everything was open all through November. Very few people were going to restaurants. I think everybody understood that was a huge exposure risk. Also, every time you went in anywhere, you had to scan your code. You had a health code on your phone. And so the more places you went in, the more risk you had that somebody else there would have been exposed, and you would be ordered to stay home at the very least. So people were trying to go to as few places as possible. So the trains were and the trains never stopped running, but the subway was definitely much emptier than normal Beijing subway crowds, which are usually pretty dense. You know, China has expanded its subways so much. At one point I had managed to ride on every line in China, but that was now, I think, about every line in Beijing, but that was like about 10 years ago, and there are like so many more. So people had told me, well, it's not quite as dense as it used to be because there's so many more lines, but the idea that there were like empty seats, that was not normal. And so people were already being super cautious, and that just kept increasing through the month of November. The rumors about more places. And actually, it isn't just rumors. I mean, on the apps, you could look up where there were exposures. So there were like these maps that showed you. So, because they were trying to like give people information to avoid getting exposed. So people were, and you pull it up, and it's just was ones they were looking at. So it was like more than there were actual cases. It just looked like dots everywhere. So people were being as careful as they could. And then by the end of November, people were getting really nervous. I mean, the general feeling was there were so many cases that there was a huge risk of another like major lockdown. Everybody was expecting that the city of Beijing might go into lockdown. And so we were all stockpiling food in our houses, and and when you went to the store, there was plenty of food, but some items would be sold out and stuff like that because people were busy buying up as much as they could. At some point in late November, the U.S. Embassy sent out a notice to citizens just advising them to stockpile. And like every Chinese friend I had sent me this notice. They seemed to think the embassy knew something that they didn't know, which wasn't, I'm sure, true. They just were hearing the same thing everybody else was and seeing the cases go up. And so that was sort of the situation. And also the economic situation was just clearly getting worse and worse, right? And there were all these scenes, I mean, the one at Foxconn in Zhengzhou became sort of very famous, where you had this picture of all these workers running away because there was an outbreak at the factory. But there was constantly these things where a factory there'd be some exposure or something, or there were exposure in the community, and so the factory would lock down. So the people who were in the factory kind of got stuck working all the time, and the people outside the factory couldn't get their hours. And so there was a lot of economic disruption going on. The economy was bad. There's a letter that became very public from Terry Gao, the head of Foxconn, and Foxconn is the producer of Apple products, warning the Chinese government that this was sort of unsustainable economically. The European Chamber
He had a letter. I mean, isn't there a risk for him to take a position, such a public position? Or
he's a foreign CEO. The risk to him, I mean, so and that has a company. Yeah, and he has, tens or hundreds of thousands of employees in China. I don't think the Chinese government's going to kick Foxconn out. But the European Chamber had said it to them months before, actually, and was pretty vocal. I would guess lots of Chinese CEOs were saying the same thing to them privately. And the economic indicators were clearly going in the wrong direction. So I think there was a lot and that economic anxiety also translated into sort of what was happening at the popular level. A lot of the sort of conflicts that you saw in November involved migrant workers. And a lot of migrant workers are in the service sector, and the service sector was just destroyed, right? I mean, if people aren't going out, significant number of migrant workers in a city like Beijing or Shanghai been there a while and maybe own their own little restaurant or whatever, and though barbershop, whatever, and those are all getting I mean, so many people lost their businesses basically, right? So they're getting hurt. The students had been confined to campus basically for the entire fall semester as things got worse, so they were sort of not very happy. And these days, like certainly in Beijing, the students all tend to have internships. They're doing all this stuff to like build for their jobs, and they can't leave campus. So their anxiety about future employment is also going up as the economy is cratering. So there's like just so many different things going on that were, and then the testing system itself and the quarantine system were hitting capacity, because the way they did the testing was that they pooled 10 people together into one test. If everybody was negative, great. But if one person in that 10 was positive, they would call back all 10 to retest. So the minute it's a lot of positives, suddenly you're calling back a lot of people and the system just bogs down. So it was taking days to recontact people. It was really bogging down. And then the cities were saying they were going to need to build many more fever hospitals to accommodate the number of people who were sick. And so that was another burden that I think the central government was starting to be aware of. So all of this was happening when the fire happened at Urumqi, where it appears that people were locked in their apartment building because they were under lockdown and they weren't able to get out during the fire. This was like a visceral fear for so many people, because this idea of lockdowns where things were chained, it didn't always happen. Sometimes they put a guard at the front gate, but it happened enough that people throughout China were very afraid it might happen to them. And I had a friend who was in one of these fever hospitals, and it was just chained. The doors were locked at night and they were not able to get out either. So that really just hit a chord, which I think is a lot of the reason why you saw the protests kind of erupt then, because it really just spoke to a visceral fear of people.
So the context was you had an explosion of cases, which was just straining everything. You had the economic anxiety, which manifested itself in different ways, including migrant workers. And then you had some of these very salient events like the fire, that kind of all of this came together. Was also, I mean, maybe this was just because I watch football, but some people were also saying the Football World Cup, and people in China seeing people in stadiums in Qatar without masks and all these crowds, that made a difference. But maybe that's just
I doubt it. Okay. I mean, I never heard anyone mention the World Cup at all, to be honest. And people had been, up until November, people were not masking that much. People were going out and about. I mean, and remember, for the first 2 years of COVID, Chinese people were moving around much more easily than people in the West. So I think economic anxiety and stuff, and I do think the reason zero COVID ended in its current form on December 7th had a lot to do with the fact that it just became unsustainable, that they couldn't keep up with the number of tests, they couldn't keep up with the fever hospitals, and the government just realized if they suddenly ramped things up, the economy was absolutely going to crater. So, but I think a lot of the frustrations that people had were extremely local. I mean, one of the things is, while there was this national policy, it was being administered at the very, very local level, that it was your district government that often decided what happened to you, and often even your local residence committee in the compound in which you lived. And so, like, when I was forced to do those extra 7 days of quarantine, the notice that appeared on my health code said, if you are in Beijing, you need to test twice in the next 3 days. And if you are outside Beijing, you must stay away for 7 days. It didn't say anything about I had to quarantine. And my hotel, I heard the people at my front desk of the hotel, when they called the district government to ask what I was supposed to do, argue with them, that saying, but shouldn't she just do it for 3 days? Why are you saying 7 days, and blah, blah, blah. And then I actually had some fairly influential people call and try to argue with the district government, and they were just like, no. So
I think this is one of the most interesting things, which I didn't quite appreciate, and many other people don't, that it's really the district and the neighborhood administrations that were driving policy rather than the national government.
Well, so it's the combination, right? So, I mean, there are a couple things. First of all, a lot of times with the district governments, they want to show they're complying with the rules, right? So they will often choose to outdo each other to show their sort of enthusiasm for the system, kind of. And so you had a lot of that phenomenon.
And just one point of clarification: the district, say you have a city of Beijing. Within Beijing, there are a certain number of districts.
Right.
So it's a district is below a city level. It's
district is below a city, and actually, I'm pretty sure that the district government they were talking about was actually a sub-district.
Okay.
Because Beijing is a huge city,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So the district level is many million, and I'm pretty sure that the people they were talking to was essentially the wider neighborhood. So when I was at the hotel, so yeah, so it's often very, very local. And then the other thing that happens, though, is at the housing development level, there's this thing called the residence committee. And while there are also like some employees of the residence committee, a lot of the people who are involved in the residence committee are retirees. A lot of the retirees really liked zero COVID. It made them feel safe, right? This is the group that just kind of thought it could go on forever, right? And so oftentimes they're interpreting the rules more strictly than either the city or the district government. So there was a lot of that. So, and I think oftentimes when you looked at these conflicts, a certain amount of the conflict is between like migrant workers that are living within these same neighborhoods and local long-term residents, especially the retirees who have a good pension and are not all that worried about the economy. Probably should be, but they're thinking, zero COVID is good, because it wasn't the case that everybody thought that zero COVID was bad, but people were getting a lot more anxiety by the end of November.
Yeah. And then as we go into the end of November, beginning of December, I mean, how did the sort of lockdown get lifted? It seemed, at least from the outside, it was quite dramatic, just how quickly things turned.
It wasn't, right? So they made this announcement of these 10 points on December 7th that loosened most of the rules. Didn't loosen all. It still left freedom for educational institutions, central government institutions, state-owned enterprises could all continue to have additional rules. And I think that often and especially the education institutions actually did. While they sent home a bunch of students, if they said, if you want to leave, you can go and take your classes online. But a lot of students, they don't have good enough web access at home, internet at home, or, Chinese people live in very tiny apartments. So they're worried if they go home, they have nowhere to study. So actually, at least in Beijing, most of the students stayed on campus for a while until they just decided to send everybody home when everybody was sick. So it was more or less of a sudden, but first of all, it didn't change people's behavior that much. People already weren't going out on the street. And after they lifted the restrictions, the city was completely dead. I mean, nobody was going anywhere. And there'd already been, in the week or so, I think, leading up to that, a lot of like restaurants had closed and things like that, but not all. And a lot were only open for takeout. They weren't open for people to actually go in. But afterwards, pretty much most things were just shut for a while, except for stores were open. You could get food. I mean, it was at right around that time, it was hard to get delivery, but I figured out if I did it first thing in the morning, I could get anything I wanted and then just stick it in the fridge and microwave it whenever I wanted it. So there was never a food shortage or anything like that. But the key thing is there never was a change in behavior that would have led to more transmission. The reality was there were so many people who had gotten COVID prior to opening that it was already spreading like wildfire. And I think there are a couple of things. One is, if you were a migrant worker and your throat started to tickle or whatever, if you possibly could, you just went home, because there was a lot less testing and everything out in most rural areas than there was in the cities. So, and, I mean, even when I talked to one taxi driver who, when his compound was locked down, he just stayed in his car for a while, right? And I knew of a whole bunch of people who, when their compound was about to be locked down, they moved to somewhere else. So a lot of spreading was just happening because people were moving around a lot to avoid lockdowns prior. And so it was already kind of everywhere before they opened up. And it was, I guess, about to hit the peak, because pretty much as soon as they opened up, almost everybody got COVID. And I got COVID, I guess, about a week after. I know of 2 people in Beijing who didn't get COVID. It's, they estimate now it's like 80-90% of the entire population got it. I mean, it just was moving very, very fast. And it did not matter what kind of vaccination you had. I mean, I had 4 mRNAs and I got it just as easily as everybody else.
And on the vaccine, there's this idea that the Chinese vaccines weren't as good as the Western mRNA ones, and there was also stories around the elderly retirees were hesitant to take vaccines. Tell me a bit more about that.
So there's data from Hong Kong suggesting that if you got 3 of the Chinese vaccines, it was almost as good as if you got 3 mRNAs. 2 mRNAs definitely did better than 2 Chinese vaccines. So getting fully vaccinated plus the 1 booster was really important. There's some data from Singapore showing if you had 4 or 5 of the mRNAs, that was still a bit better. I don't think anybody thinks that the Chinese could have gotten everybody up to 4 or 5. I mean, Hong Kong didn't manage that. So 3 Chinese vaccines actually seem to work as well for preventing severe disease and death. But nothing was preventing much transmission. And as I said, I had mRNAs, and I know other people who had mRNAs and still got sick. If you were in China in December, you got sick. The issue of elderly not being vaccinated was very real. It was mostly an urban phenomenon, which I think has been missed. The rural vaccination rate for the elderly was higher than for urban residents. My guess is that's because local districts were given quotas that they needed to get X% of the population vaccinated. And in much of rural China, the working age population simply isn't there because they've all migrated. And so if you're going to be told you need 70%, you're going to have to pull in a bunch of old people or whatever. Or, because, and overall, China's vaccination rate was over 90% at the beginning of this outbreak. Why weren't urban elderly vaccinated? Well, the first reason is because of the way the Chinese launched the vaccine campaign in the first place. They started with the working age population. They did that because there was no immediate outbreak. They weren't dealing with death. And so their first goal was to, if disease was reintroduced, to reduce transmission. So you choose to vaccinate first the people who have more contacts in a day, which are people who are sort of out and about in society. So there's a sort of public health logic to what they did, but the messaging was terrible. People took that as there's something wrong with the vaccine for the elderly. And it wasn't just the elderly who took it, their doctors took it that way. Because so many elderly, people would tell me that their parents were told by doctor, oh, you're too weak, you shouldn't get the vaccine, wait till after your cancer treatment, or no, you have heart disease, maybe you shouldn't get it. So a lot of people were being told by doctors, no, don't get the vaccine. Second thing that happened was there was a lot of anti-vax messaging running around in China. So the Chinese government was repeating a lot of the anti-vax, anti-mRNA stuff from the West, often, just taking the Fox News clips. And then Western press all kept saying the Chinese vaccines don't work. And that was being picked up, for urban people through the internet, So the general sort of miasma was vaccines don't work, right? And honestly, and there was this weird aspect that the Chinese vaccine is very non-reactogenic. If you get it, you don't get a huge swelling or pain or illness. It's not like the mRNAs, which can often make you feel quite sick. It's more, there's some other shots I've had that are like that, but that, you just don't get much of a feeling when it's in and then it's done. That's usually considered by public health people to be good. It seems like it's less scary for people, whatever. But it created this weird thing where people really wondered if it was real or if they'd gotten a fake vaccine. When I first went out to dinner with a couple of my old friends, I always asked people, are you vaccinated? And they said, yeah, but we don't know if we got the real thing or they just gave us a saline shot because we had no reaction. So even people who got it were kind of skeptical. I talked to one guy, his mom had only gotten one shot and his dad had 3. And I said, why? Obviously she's not anti-vax because she got a shot. And he said, well, she said it didn't work on her. And it's like, what did work on her mean? Well, the father had had some mild reaction and the mother had had none. So she figured it was like not working. So that was like a strange additional thing. This all being kind of propelled by the fact that China has had several fake vaccine scandals in the last decade. So the idea that you might be given a fake vaccine was already out there in the
so obviously if you don't get a reaction, then you just think they're just giving me saline or something.
Yeah. So and there's this history, although the Chinese government was really trying to prevent that. They arrested a bunch of people at the beginning for selling some fake vaccine. They were actually trying to stop this from being an issue, but it was out there in people's minds. And so you just had all these, and then they just felt safe with zero COVID. So there was just no sense of urgency. There really were a lot of elderly people who just kind of thought this could keep going and were not really thinking through the fact that this was going to have to end at some point. And clearly, when the Chinese government initially adopted the policy, they assumed that COVID would sort of get controlled in the rest of the world, and they would then be able to reopen without a big deal. That turned out was never going to happen. But it's that problem. There wasn't any communication to people that this was eventually going to have to end, and so you needed to get ready. They were clearly gearing up for that in November. They tried doing the gradual opening. There were these 20 points that they issued on November 11th that sort of got rid of this idea of secondary contacts, that you didn't have to isolate if you'd simply been in contact with someone who'd been in contact with someone who got the disease. And they changed some of the quarantine rules and a bunch of other stuff. It gave people the hope that things were going to gradually open, but had the sort of perverse impact that as the number of cases went up and instead things closed down. I think that was one of the levels of frustration, in addition to all the ones that we already discussed. But the other thing was they were clearly gearing up for a new vaccination campaign. You know, they launched it on December 1st, and they had 11 different new vaccines. I do actually know a bunch of people who were given tests in clinical trials or just sort of experiments in November. So they were getting ready for a new vaccine campaign. So I think they were gearing up for a gradual opening that would in fact involve a vaccination campaign and sort of communicating to people that, yeah, we are going to open up and there are going to be cases. And the problem was doing that in the winter with Omicron was just impossible, that there was just too much disease around. I think had they done it last summer, they could have actually succeeded in a gradual opening, and it might have been much better. But I think they were unable, for political reasons, to do it until after the Party Congress in October. And so that pushed them into the winter.
Yeah. And then you were there for the first week of January, and then you returned back to the US.
Right.
In that sort of final week you were there, what was the general mood? Had people changed their behavior? Were people going to shops, restaurants? Did it feel more normal?
Yes, it felt a little bit ebullient, actually, for the people who had sort of made it through the disease and were able to be out and about. Now, a lot of people lost elderly relatives. So especially, for the people I know in their 50s and 60s, a lot of them lost their parents. And so for them, it was a really tough time. And a lot of my colleagues were, had headed back to the countryside to take care of old parents. It was really rough. But especially when you're talking about sort of the young people in their 20s and 30s, they're sort of running out and about. They're back in restaurants. The subway ridership was back up. There definitely was a feeling of, we made it through this thing. And for most of them, COVID didn't turn out to be that big a deal, and they were just happy to be done with it. Also, so at the end of November, beginning of December, if you got COVID then, there was a shortage of just basic stuff like ibuprofen and decongestant and cough syrup and the stuff people wanted to treat mild symptoms. By the end of December, there was plenty of all that stuff. So, because the shortage was artificially caused by the fact that during this zero COVID period, if you bought any of those things, the local government would come and try to figure out if you had COVID. So people were afraid to just buy headache medicine at the pharmacy. So everybody had run through whatever stockpile they had at home, and there was just nothing left. And China produces a third of the world's ibuprofen. So it was all just being, shipped to my local CVS. So once the demand exploded in China, same with the home test kits. Very, very hard to find those around December 7th, when everybody suddenly wanted them. By 2 weeks later, there were home test kits everywhere, because I don't know if you've noticed, most of them are made in China. Certainly the ones I got from the NHS when I was in Glasgow still have the Chinese labels on them, right?
Yeah.
So it was sort of a, one of those supply chain things that had to be diverted to the domestic market. And it actually happened pretty quickly. But if you got sick in early December, it was a little more miserable because there was not much for symptoms. But by the end of December, you could treat your sore throat or your headache or whatever. So end of last week of December, beginning of January, people are already out and about. By the beginning of January, a lot of people out. And I experienced my first traffic jams of the entire time I'd been in China during that last week I was in town.
And looking ahead, I mean, do you think they'll ever go back to some kind of zero COVID or sort of local lockdowns at all, or we've passed that now?
I don't think so. Not for this disease. I mean, the truth is that local lockdown did work for Wuhan. And, they really did suppress it with the original disease. The track and trace, they never really did the same kind of lockdowns during SARS, but the track and trace system really did work and did actually eradicate SARS. So there's no reason to believe that some of these actions, if given the correct disease and the correct time frame, don't work. It's just you can't do them for 3 years. And also, Omicron transmits too quickly. By the time you got the result back from the PCR test, you'd probably given it to 5 people, right? And I should say the other thing about this mass PCR testing is they were not catching every case. I mean, you would line up at these booths, and oftentimes they would just kind of wave the wand in your mouth and not actually touch anything, and certainly not touch your throat. And so if you needed to actually swab, they weren't really doing it. I mean, the incentives for the local government were to show they were working hard, but also not to have too many cases. So the incentive is to find a couple, but not a lot. And so, especially as it went along, right? I think it was much more effective at the beginning when everybody was geared up, and then just sort of fatigue hits anywhere in the world.
Yeah. Okay, so that's China and COVID, a big topic that we've covered. I did want to talk a bit about your day job, your main area of focus, which is environment, climate policy, and so on. In terms of China's climate policy, again, a Western cynical view is that they have a goal to do something about carbon emissions and the environment, but in practice, they ignore it all. They're building lots of coal mines and things, and they care more about the economics than they do about the environment. So is that a caricature of Chinese policy?
It's just wrong.
Okay. 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 Correct me then.
I mean, the Chinese have a climate policy, and they're implementing it. I mean, I do think that the goals in the current 5-year plan, which were adopted in 2021, are relatively easy for them to meet. Right. So these are improvements in energy efficiency. There are increases in renewable energy. There are increases in nuclear energy. And I think they had left themselves with some wiggle room so that they would have more to offer at Glasgow if the United States had shown up with something. And as you may recall, the U.S. did not, in fact, pass any climate change law in 2021. And so whatever the Chinese had in their back pocket stayed there in terms of making international commitments. And then the US finally did pass serious climate legislation in 2022. It's a little different than the way the Chinese would like to see it, and probably the way Europe would like to see it as well, because to get what the reductions are, you have to use a model, because what's in the law is a lot of incentives to adopt cleaner energy, huge incentives for electrification of households, electrification of transport, etc., but not embedded in the law the kind of targets that like the Chinese have in their law, or I think that you get in the European emissions trading system or something like that. But it's clear that the US now has serious climate law. And I think if the US-China relationship overall had been better, you might have been able to get new commitments at Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27 this past year, 2022. But of course, the US-China relationship was terrible. And so the Chinese really didn't feel any urgency to commit things internationally. But that's about international commitments. It's not about what they're doing at home. And what they're doing at home is actually really taking both air pollution and climate change seriously. And so they've done an enormous amount to reduce urban air pollution, much of which also has huge climate benefits. So this is switching from using coal power to natural gas, which is not perfect, but is certainly less climate forcing for things like urban heating and things like that. Been a huge change. Massive increase in the amount of renewable energy, big push toward energy efficiency. So the coal power that they do use is much, much more efficient than it was 10 or 20 years ago. They've also put a lot of pollution abatement equipment on heavy industry, coal, steel, all this kind of stuff, but that doesn't have as much of a climate impact. But they also have been, I mean, they're really the world leaders in electrifying their transportation system, which is a prerequisite to decarbonizing. You know, even if you're using coal-fired power, if people are using battery run vehicles, they're actually using less power than if they're using petrol. So in China, the electrification, I would say, has three prongs. The first is, you know, they have their high-speed rail system, and much of that has now been electrified. And remember, every high-speed train between Beijing and Shanghai is 5 jet planes averted, right? There are 1,500 people on every single one of those. And during normal times, they run one every 10 minutes. Enormous prevention of an increase in air travel domestically that is really dramatic and rarely talked about. Second is subways. China now has 45 cities with subways in them. Just looked it up. Last time I looked it up, it was 35. I mean, it just, you never know. There's always more. You know, and as I said, I mean, in Beijing, I think there are now 25 subway lines or something. I mean, it just keeps growing and growing. And the Chinese subway system definitely has a huge last mile problem because the stops tend to be relatively far apart. But the bicycle rental system solves a lot of that last mile problem. And they've really gotten, and certainly in Beijing, that is now well managed. You know, you don't have the huge piles of them in the bicycle graveyards and all that. And then the third prong of electrification is the one everybody keeps ignoring, is the electric two-wheelers. I mean, this has now become a primary means of urban transportation in China. China has 300 million electric two-wheelers. And if you think about what most developing country cities look like with petrol-driven two-wheelers, right? These two-stroke engines that are incredibly dirty. This has been a huge part of improving urban air quality using battery-driven two-wheelers. But it's also an important part of climate change. And yes, the Chinese are busy introducing electric automobiles as well. But that is never going to be as important a part of the transportation system as the two-wheelers. And people just don't talk about it, including the Chinese government, because this part was sort of it's sort of bottom up. I mean, people bought them, companies sold them. They weren't allowed to buy petrol driven two-wheelers, so they chose these battery ones, but there wasn't a big policy of promoting battery two-wheelers. It's been very much sort of naturally occurring, and so people aren't paying attention. But if we're going to think about how we're going to stop air pollution in Hanoi or New Delhi or Nairobi, it's going to be electric two-wheelers. And so this is not only an important part of the Chinese system, but it's the part that everybody else has to start paying attention to, because it's going to be really important. The other thing they've done is they've electrified the urban sort of delivery system, that the big don't really, certainly in a city like Beijing, the big trucks don't really come into town very much. What they use within town are these little sort of mini bread box type delivery things that are all electric run. So you see little electric mini trucks everywhere. And so again, huge impact on urban transportation, and enormously helpful for how we're going to get to a non-carbon future. Now, much of that is still being powered by coal-fired power plants. It's still better. But the other thing is that big message I got from everyone in China was, don't pay that much attention to the fact that they're building more coal-fired power plants, because they aren't really going to use them. So there was this big, so they're using what they have. They don't really need more. This is about control rather than about a need for more power. So what happened was there was a big energy shortage in September. These electricity shortages get caused by a disconnect between the price of coal and the price of power. So coal is a free market price in China. And when the price of coal goes up, the power plants often gamble that it'll come back down again. And so they stop buying. And every so often they really blow it and they essentially run out of coal. Usually that happens because there's a snowstorm, and when they suddenly try to order it, they can't get it. This was September, so there was no snowstorm. They just really sort of played the odds and failed. So this has caused a lot of cities to want to have their own power plants, want to have more control, and it's led to a bunch of power plant building. And everyone I talked to felt it wasn't going to really lead to an increase in usage. It was just going to create more power plants that were being used less.
So it's almost like an insurance policy or backup policy in case things go wrong, rather than, you know, their main source of power.
That's what people were saying. So it's a waste of resources. There's a lot of embedded carbon in it. I wouldn't say it's a great policy, but it's probably not as alarming as it's been portrayed. Okay. And they really are building a lot of renewables. And people in China told me, you know, solar is now actually cheaper than coal, which is great. And so it's a question of, you know, getting it well integrated into the grid. It's now all grid connected. That problem a decade ago where things weren't getting connected to the grid seems to have been resolved. So I'm pretty optimistic. I think most people think that China will peak well before its international commitment, right? Its international commitment is that they will peak emissions before 2030. And most people expect they'll peak in the next couple of years. You know, the international negotiators all want them to say that at an international meeting. And they don't feel like it. I mean, I think they feel very little pressure to be more forthcoming than they are, given what other people's international commitments are. They never want to fail to meet a target. They just get so much more criticism when they fail to meet things than, for example, the United States does. So they're very cautious internationally. But I will say, I attended a conference run by an NGO, an American NGO in China on decarbonization of sorry, that was a fire engine going by my house.
It's okay, we'll edit that bit out, don't worry.
Okay, so let me start over. So I attended a conference run by an American NGO in China on decarbonization of heavy industry. So it was a webinar. They had 38,000 people log on. So that wasn't, so there was like morning session, afternoon session. So, people may have logged on 2-3 different times, but, we're still talking at least 10,000 different people logged on to this thing. It was amazing. And they had local government officials from heavily polluting provinces. They had representatives of heavy industry, all talking about how to decarbonize, like working on using hydrogen in the steel making process to replace some of the carbon aspects of it, all this kind of technology. Huge interest compared to even a decade ago. So people really take it seriously. They feel the central government, this is where, central government goals can cause all kinds of crazy stuff where local districts are, building quarantine centers or whatever, but they also can cause local governments, even in coal-rich areas, to think we better come up with alternatives. And that's really where they are right now. So I think they're taking their climate policy very, very seriously. The big risk that's out there is what's known as overshooting. So one of the modelers I talked to said, look, the world's going to keep to 1.5 degrees by 2100. I don't think that's that hard. The issue is, what's it going to be in 2035 or 2040? And there's a severe possibility that we're going to be well above 1.5 and then go back down as the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere reduces. And there are a number of ways to address overshooting, and some of them are these geoengineering things that are, some of them a little bit scary, in my opinion, like shooting a bunch of stuff up into the atmosphere.
I've seen the movies.
But the other one is reducing methane pollution much more aggressively, because methane is much more forcing than CO2. It doesn't last as long in the atmosphere, but while it does, it actually has a much bigger impact. And the amount of methane that we're releasing, actually, studies in the last decade have shown is much higher than we thought before. Oil and gas pipelines leaking. If you have a gas stove in your house, apparently your stove is always leaking. Highly recommend replacing with electric. And, so it's like your pipelines, it's also urban solid waste, it's also animal husbandry, it's also rice paddies, and it's coal bed and coal methane leakage. So the US pushed a methane pledge at Glasgow of a 30% reduction, which a lot of countries signed on to, but China didn't. I think one of the important issues there is that controlling methane in China is actually harder than in the United States, because oil and gas pipelines, you patch the pipeline. Coal bed and coal mine methane, it's actually seeping up from the ground. So it's technically just a much more difficult issue. The animal husbandry, the urban solid waste are basically the same everywhere. And China is no longer a country of backyard farmers. I mean, you have big facilities that could do much more control, as could ours. But the rice paddy issue is a huge challenge. And you only get the methane when the paddies are flooded, because it's bacteria in the water. And the Chinese have actually done a ton of work on reducing the number of days during which they flood, because they don't have much water. And so I keep wondering if that isn't an area where they don't have something they could share with other countries in terms of reducing the amount of flooding that they do, even if you have even if you have the water, you might want to reduce your flooding in order to reduce the methane problem. But clearly that's an area where we need more science, because it's technically very difficult to deal with. The coal bed and coal mine methane also is one where you really do need more science to figure out how to deal with it. So it's definitely areas where I think the world could get a lot more done if we work together cooperatively and actually.
And more generally, your sense is that China is going to stay the course in these climate policies, that it's part of their strategic goals, and they're going to be fairly sort of consistent in trying to deliver at least their internal goals.
Yeah, and then they see the future as a non-carbon future, and they want to be leaders in the technology. I mean, it's no accident that they're major exporters of wind and solar and nuclear. They see these as, growth industries.
Yeah. Okay, well, I mean, we've covered a huge amount of ground, so I did want to round off with a few personal questions. The first one was on youngsters, and we have many listeners to our podcast who are students or about to leave university. What advice would you give to people as they leave university and enter the real world?
So a couple of things. One, as you can tell from my rather circuitous career, is I think the most important thing is to just do something. If it's great the people who know exactly what they want in life and just aim toward it. That's fantastic. But if you don't know, just do something, and it all adds up eventually, and your various experiences will come together to lead to other things that you want. The second one is that most people hate their first job. And I saw that also with PhD students, if they had not worked out in the real world first. In that, when you're an undergraduate, it's all about you and bringing out your full potential, and everybody cares about you as a person. And the minute you get into the real world of jobs or a PhD program, it's all about what you can produce, and nobody really cares about you at all. And so it's really important to figure out if you hate your first job or you just hate being a grown-up. And we all hate being a grown-up, and that you're just going to have to figure out how to, find that validation outside of your work life, hopefully. But it is important to separate those two, because I think sometimes people walk away from things they might actually like.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great advice. And then another question, now that I can pick your brain, do you have any productivity hacks in terms of staying on top of research and news and information? Because obviously you cover a lot. There's a lot of depth in what you do. I mean, do you have a system to just stay on top of things?
No. I feel like I'm easily distracted. I'm just interested in everything. So I tend to pay attention and sort of go down rabbit holes, but I don't honestly have a great hack for anyone. No.
Okay, no worries. You're not alone. Now, on books, I love books, so I always ask for people's recommendations. Are there certain books that really influenced you over your career? It could be, related to your academic work or your field of interest, or it could be outside, in personal life as well.
So the book, I was thinking about this. The book that has really influenced me, I think, because I read it as an undergraduate, so it sort of stayed with me. It's a very obscure book called In Search of Wealth and Power, Yen Fu in the West by Benjamin Schwartz. And Yen Fu was this 19th century Chinese translator of Mill and Spencer. And what influenced me about it was that Yen Fu saw in Mill and Spencer things that no Western reader sees in their writing, which are generally seen as very individualist. And what Yen Fu saw was the assumption behind it of a strong state. and that none of this individuality would actually be possible if you didn't first have a strong state. And I think that's really influenced sort of my understanding of development in China and of this sort of need that most people in China feel for a strong state, and sort of that conflict that is embedded in these philosophies that we in the West often choose to ignore.
Yeah, no, that's a great recommendation. I'll definitely look out for it. Well, with that, the final thing I wanted to ask is what's the best way for people to follow you and your work?
So I have a website which I need to update. Probably hasn't been updated for half a year or something. But debseligsohn.com. I'm on Twitter at Deb Seligsohn. Sometimes tweet, sometimes don't. And I publish stuff in academic journals and whatnot.
Okay, I'll include links to your personal website and your Twitter as well, in case people want to reach out to you. So, with that, thanks a lot for your the wealth of knowledge that you've imparted to us, and hopefully to our listeners as well. And good luck with all the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please subscribe to the podcast show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Leave a 5-star rating, a nice comment, and let other people know about the show. We'd be super grateful. Finally, sign up for our free newsletter at macrohive.com/free. That's macrohive.com/free. We'll be back soon, so tune in then.